This presentation will show you how Gatorade's advertisement has varied starting from when it was first created in the 1960s to today. I'll be pointing out the similarities and key points that Gatorade began to include in their advertisements, and you'll be able to see the similarities between each decade as the ads progress as well. Here we have an ad that was shown to the public in the late 1960s. Gatorade was actually introduced to the public in 1965, so this ad quickly followed that. And we begin to see the thirst quencher slogan, which is pointed out with the red arrow. And Gatorade began to incorporate this slogan into everything having to do with Gatorade. It was their main slogan that they wanted people to recognize Gatorade by. And as you can tell with the blue arrow, I pointed to the very wordy description, and I think the reason Gatorade decided to use such a literature-based ad was just so that they could inform consumers on the beverage and what it contained with statistics and facts. Since Gatorade was recently established at the time, they wanted to appeal to everyone, and they wanted to persuade people as to why Gatorade was such the perfect thirst quencher, why it worked, and why it was the choice beverage for a lot of athletes. And also where the white arrow is pointing, you can see that even though Gatorade was recently established, at that time they had already had such great supporters and sponsors like the MLB, the NBA, and the NFL. So that was quite an accomplishment, and they wanted their key audiences and consumers to know that. So here's an ad presented in the 1970s. At this point, a lot more people know about Gatorade. The literature in this ad is still apparent, but it's not so much statistics and facts as the ad in the 60s was. This one is a much more humorous approach. The literature that's presented next to the captions of the pictures where the blue arrow is pointing at, those are just descriptions between a tennis instruction and how to take a sip of Gatorade. So it's a much more humorous approach, as you can tell. With the red arrow, you can still see that the Gatorade is still using the thirst quencher slogan. And the reason for that is because Gatorade wanted to make it a priority that people would know Gatorade as the thirst quencher. That was very important to them. But since this was after the full establishment of Gatorade, that's why this one doesn't contain as much facts, and it is much more of a humorous approach just so that people become more at ease with Gatorade and are more likely to use it. So in this ad of the 1980s, you can already see that there's barely any literature context in comparison to the ad that was presented in the 60s and the 70s. This one, the only words that are in the ad are very straight to the point. It's very simple, and it reads a lot about the main points of Gatorade, like the fluids and the minerals and the energy as results. And this one doesn't really show the athletes drinking directly from the Gatorade. It's more of the effect that comes with drinking Gatorade and the energy and stamina that athletes experience once they drink it. And also, you can still see with the red arrow that Gatorade is still using the thirst slogans. And this one isn't exactly the thirst quencher one, but it does say that Gatorade is thirst aid for that deep down body thirst. So they are still going with that thirst ad, and they still wanted their consumers to know Gatorade as being the thirst quencher. In this 1990s ad, it was a generation where everyone wanted to be like Mike. Michael Jordan was an amazing basketball player, and everyone wanted to be like him. And so at this point, Gatorade was starting to incorporate a lot of athlete endorsements, Michael Jordan being their main one. And this is where their key consumers and audience began to change drastically. At this point, they wanted to appeal to a much younger generation, the younger generation that looked up to Michael a lot. So looking at this ad, even though there is some literature included, the consumers still get the main idea and see that Michael Jordan does rely on Gatorade. And we still see the thirsting advertisement that they're using, and Gatorade still incorporates this thirst slogan because they still wanted their consumers to know Gatorade as the thirst quencher and that it was the choice beverage for athletes and for everyone. And we still have the sponsors and supporters mentioned in this ad. I think that was very important to include, especially in addition to incorporating the Chicago Bulls and Michael. It was important to know that other other sports teams and other corporations were using them and were relying on Gatorade. I think that was very important to show all the consumers. Here's an ad that was published in the year 2000 in a magazine. As you can already tell, this is a very different Gatorade approach to appealing to consumers. This one is a more real-life situation. I mean, it still includes exaggeration, but it's not as staged as the other pictures of the other ads were. Again, this one doesn't show the athlete drinking directly from Gatorade, but instead it shows the effect of drinking Gatorade and how much energy one can have after drinking it. This is definitely a different consumer appeal. In this advertisement, it's a young man playing basketball, and it could potentially be any young athlete. And again, this one's appealing to the young generation just to prove that anyone who drinks Gatorade can have the same energy and stamina as this young man does right here. This one contains barely any literature at all, and instead it mainly depends on the visual description and presentation of it. And there's enough going on in the picture that consumers don't really need an explanation, and especially at this point everyone already knows about Gatorade and a lot of people do already depend on it. And in the picture you can see that after the athlete drinks the Gatorade, he has enough stamina to do such damage on the courts. And what's very creative is how he is sweating Gatorade. I thought it was a very creative approach when I first saw this ad. And I think that this exaggeration is a key way for Gatorade to appeal to everybody and to show, and even though people know it's an exaggeration, they know that it works and that everyone does depend on Gatorade. And we can still see the sponsor mention in this ad. It's definitely not as noticeable as the other ads had. This one is on the basketball and it's a Spalding and NBA feature, so we still have the supporters there. So as you can tell, Gatorade still wants to have those other companies that are working with them, and they still want people to know that sports teams depend on them, as well as the NBA and the NHL and the MLB. So it was very important to showcase that to their consumers. And in this ad, the main difference that I actually saw first was how Gatorade did away with the thirst quencher slogan, and this is actually the time when Gatorade began to bring in the "Is it in you" slogan, which is what a lot of us are familiar with today. And I think this one is a much more dramatic slogan, and it makes you think a lot more. And instead of being just a very blunt thirst quencher, the "Is it in you" could relate to a lot of things, and it really depends on the consumer. Here's just a quick recap about the similarities and differences in each decade. And even though the advertisement published in the year 2000 did stray away from the original ads, it was at that time when Gatorade's sales actually went up, and it was right around the same time that they began to change their slogan from the thirst quencher to "Is it in you?" And what was very interesting is that even though the thirst quencher slogan had worked for such a long time, and even though Gatorade was doing very well in the sales area, such a subtle change in their slogan increased their sales immensely. But that's it for my Gatorade advertisement comparison, and hopefully you guys will be able to recognize the changes as well.